Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In the third part of her work, The Ethics of Ambiguity, the fourth section is called The Present and the Future. And Simone de Beauvoir is going to begin by talking about the ambiguity of the future. And really there's two meanings to this. The future is ambiguous, rightly understood, but she's also calling attention to the fact that there's two different ways of, we could say, not just understanding, but orienting oneself to the future in terms of one's freedom and how one regards oneself and other human beings. So she's going to tell us the future has two meanings corresponding to the two aspects of the ambiguous condition of man, which is lack of being and which is existence. Now, these are kind of technical terms in existentialist philosophy. It helps to know a little bit about this. A little bit later, she's going to talk about that, we are not a pure positivity. We are, as human beings, a negativity. So this is kind of a commonplace in existentialist philosophy. We are not whatever being we take ourselves to be as permanent, as substances, as something that we could call in itself, but we are constantly transcending that, but in negative ways, and not just individually, but in our relations with others. So she says one way of thinking about the future is this: when I envisage my future, I consider that movement which, prolonging my existence of today, will fulfill my present projects and will surpass them towards new ends. So, for example, think of entering into a fairly new relationship with another person, a friendship, an acquaintanceship, a romantic relationship, right? You come to understand yourself in relation to the other, but you don't know exactly what that future is going to hold. But you are prolonging the existence and the determinate parts of that existence. Today, you have certain projects. There's a continuity between present and future. But the future is not just reducible to the present, right? And she says, this is the future, which Heidegger considered as a reality, which is given at each moment, right? The future is the definite direction of a particular transcendence. So we're constantly moving into that future. That is what temporality means. Now, there's another way of understanding the future, which is quite different from that. She calls this another future that people have dreamed about, in which it might be granted them to retrieve themselves, to have like a possession of self, right? As being in, and she uses three terms, in glory, happiness, or justice, right? These transcendent things. She actually capitalizes them as well. And this is a different way of conceiving of the future, but also of ourselves. And she says, this future did not prolong the present. It came down upon the world like a cataclysm, assigned by signs which cut the continuity of time. That future is going to supersede the present. And in a way, you could think of it as, well, it's going to make the present irrelevant. And that's kind of good news, bad news, right? That's good news if your present sucks and you're thinking, oh, this is going to be amazing. And she talks about, messianism. It could be the arrival of a person who's going to fix everything, a savior, meteors, right? The trumpets of the last judgment. All of this is going to be kind of redundant. And then she talks about, interestingly, Christians, now she's talking about not in the immediate beginning of Christianity, where it was very messianic, right? She says, by transporting the kingdom of God up to heaven, an afterlife, Christians have almost stripped it of its temporal character, although it's promised to the believer only at the end of his life. And then she talks about in the 18th century, so we're thinking about, the time of the philosophes and the French Revolution, anti-Christian humanism, bringing it back down to earth. There's this great sort of metaphor of, the heavenly city being brought back down to the earthly city. And she says, through the idea of progress, an idea of the future was elaborated in which these two aspects fused. The future appeared both as the meaning of our transcendence and as the immobility of being. It is human, terrestrial, and the resting place of things. And then she talks about 19th century philosophy, the systems of Hegel and Comte. Hegel, I think, is probably pretty well known to most people. He's the systematic philosopher who thinks that, consciousness develops through history, through this complex dialectical process, which, by the way, is not thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's not actually Hegel. It's more complicated than that. Comte is the father of positivism, not logical positivism, but capital P positivism in the 19th century, who also has a system, and it's equally comprehensive, and we could include others in there as well. And she goes on and she says, we also see this form invoked today as a unity of the world or as a finished socialist state. It's quite interesting that she talks about it that way in her present, because there's not a lot of people out there. Well, there are actually a lot of people out there numerically, but their importance is much smaller than it used to be in Western societies, talking about a finished socialist state. Instead, we have people who talk about the singularity and how that's going to change everything, or all of these sort of libertarian tech bros out there proposing some sort of, great solution to things. It's also totalizing, and it's imaginary, right? It's just what she's talking about here. And she says, in all of these cases, the future appears as both the infinite and as totality, as number and unity of conciliation. Here's a really important part. It is the abolition of the negative. It is fulfillment, happiness, at least for those who make it to that future. And here's where the upshot comes in. One might surmise that any sacrifice already made might be claimed in its name. However great the quantity of people sacrificed today, the quantity that will profit by their sacrifice is infinitely greater, right? In the face of the positivity of the future, the imaginary future, the present is only the negative, which must be eliminated as such. Only by dedicating itself to this positivity can the negative henceforth return to the positive. So what does this make of the present, right? The present is only this transitory existence which is made in order to be abolished. It retrieves itself only by transcending itself towards the permanence of future being. She goes on and says that it becomes a means to a final end. It is an instrument. It's only by its efficacy with regard to the coming of the future that the present is validly realized. Reduced to itself, it's nothing. It has no value except insofar as it's going somewhere else, right? And we see people who do this actually on a smaller scale. I'm going to go to college and get my degrees, and then I'm going to go on to professional school or graduate school and get those degrees, and then my life is going to finally make sense. I'll sacrifice everything to that. And, what ends up happening, their life isn't over by the time that they get there, and somehow the negative never goes away, right? Or they're like, well, I got those degrees so I can make a lot of money and accumulate things and have the house and the cars and the retirement account, right? And they get all the way to the end and realize the holes in that and the fact that they didn't live along the way because they devalued the present. So two different kinds of futures going on here. Now, if we do look at this second kind, she talks about history being presented as if it's this harmonious development, that there's some sort of reconciliation happening, and that it's a pure positivity, right? Oppression will be wiped out by itself. And you can sacrifice anything you want to this. She gives some examples of this formula. The ends justifies the means. So the present oppression has no importance if through it the world can be fulfilled as such. We could think about the sacrifices that were imposed on people in the name of, some sort of socialist utopia. We can also think about the, grinding up of human beings in the justification of we're moving forward with economic growth. This is needed to transition to the new economy. Right? People are just as liable to do that. And she says, the present dictatorship of a party with its lies and violence has no importance if by means of it the socialist, or we might even say all sorts of other states, is realized. Arbitrariness and crime will then disappear from the face of the earth. Others think more sloppily that the shilly-shallyings and the compromises have no importance because the future is going to turn out well, and in some way or another will muddle along into victory. And she calls this the tranquility of the serious. It's something that people are making of their freedom. And she says, even Hegel doesn't really buy into this. The future isn't quite given. The mind is restless. Marx did not consider the coming of the socialist state as an absolute result, but the end of a prehistory on the basis of which real history begins. And she says, we don't actually have this moment of reconciliation. Why? Because we are originally a negativity. That is the nature of our existence. No social upheaval, no moral conversion can eliminate this lack which is in the human heart. It is by making ourselves a lack of being that we exist in positive existence. Is this lack assumed but not eliminated, right? So there's not going to be any reconciliation of transcendences. As a matter of fact, we live in a world where freedom is messy. And my freedom will encounter your freedom. And there's no, way of articulating all of them perfectly in relation to each other, whether it be through one principle or another. We're constantly having to work these matters out. And she calls that the fundamental ambiguity of the human condition, one which will continue to go on. And then she raises two really important points. So she's got this formula: freedom is not a given, it's always to be won. That means we can't simply take it for granted. We're always having to use our freedom to continue extending our freedom. And that means that we consider the freedom of others as well, a point she's been hammering home over and over again. So we can't just use the excuse of, well, everybody competes with everybody else. She actually talks about, the world being at war. And she says that parties make use of this today to justify their politics when they declare the world is still at war. If that means that the struggle is not over, that the world is prey to opposed interests which affront each other violently, that's the truth. But he also means that such a situation is abnormal and calls for abnormal, that is, unethical behavior. The politics it involves can impugn every moral principle since it has only a provisional form. Later on, will act in accordance with truth and justice, because we'll get to that point where everything is fixed. Well, that's a belief in this second kind of imaginary future, using that as an excuse. We have the option to act with truth and justice, albeit not in a perfect way, in the present, and we can't take the fact that, yes, there is conflict as an excuse not to do that and be, consistent. The other thing that she points out is that the future is not actually disclosed to us. She says our hold on the future is limited. The movement of expansion of existence requires we strive at every moment to amplify it, but where it stops, our future stops too. Beyond, there's nothing more because nothing more is disclosed. From that future, that formless night, a future we might call it, we can draw no justification of our acts. We can't displace them to say, well, I'm acting like a bastard today and hurting people and exploiting people because it's going to be better for everybody else down the line. We don't know that. She says, it could be chaos or death as well as paradise. Maybe people will one day return to barbarism. Maybe one day the earth will no longer be anything but an icy planet. Man ought not entrust the care of his salvation to this uncertain and foreign future. It's up to him to assure it within his own existence, the present that continues on into the future. This existence is conceivable only as an affirmation of the future, but a human future, a finite future, which we can indeed affirm, and not just affirm, but move ourselves into.